Hello, and welcome to LSVT Global's newly launched podcast, Think Big and Loud, where we share inspiring stories, expert insights, and engaging conversations, all designed to empower and uplift those living with neurological conditions and those who love and support them. My name is Beth Peterson, and I will be your host today. And today's episode focuses on celebrating National Speech Language Hearing Month. And this month provides an opportunity to raise awareness about communication disorders and the critical role of speech language pathologists and speech language pathology assistants in providing life-altering treatment. And to help recognize this month, I'm delighted to have special guest Jennifer Gray. And Jennifer is a speech language pathologist with a primary focus in working with children and teens with Down syndrome. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Good. And if you don't mind, just by starting off and letting us know who you are, so a little bit maybe where you work and live and what got you interested in becoming a speech language pathologist.
Okay. My name is Jennifer. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I have a private practice here where we mostly do early intervention and treating people specifically with Down syndrome through private practice. I do a lot of teletherapy, even prior to COVID, to kind of reach as many people as I can because there's very few people that specialize in people with Down syndrome. And so I love what I do. It's challenging, it's fun. But really, it's kind of turned into building also more awareness around people with Down syndrome and how SLPs can better help them communicate because we haven't been too successful in that piece of things. It's getting better, but that's kind of what drew me to LSVT LOUD as well, as when I was like, man, I think this might work. And then I got trained and it did work. And now, we're here and there's a bunch of amazing things we've been able to kind of discover and do and help people with since that time. So I think that was 2018 when that first course was launched, and I took it from the Parkinson side. And so there wasn't even a kid course yet at that time or a pediatric course. And so I took it anyway and kind of crossed my fingers the whole time and it worked. And so I've been doing it ever since.
No, that's great. Yeah, that's great to hear it. So what led you to specialize in Down syndrome?
It's kind of a weird story. People that help others with Down syndrome have a family member or a friend or a personal story of some sort. I don't. I kind of came to it accidentally or naturally. I was working initially in the area of fluency. So that was kind of my first love. That's what brought me to speech language pathology. And then I kind of moved to a different area where I was learning a lot about feeding and kind of oral motor. So how the mouth moves for eating and for speaking, which was a very new concept to me. This was back in the early 2000s, kind of before those two things really kind of blossomed in one way or another. And so the people that were coming to us for those treatments either had Down syndrome, apraxia, or autism. Those were kind of the big ones that we were seeing. And I just kind of fell in love with the Down syndrome population there. And then kind of moved away from that piece of it, that kind of early movement, development, eating, and really started to look more at speech because that's what was really kind of left. So once we were kind of getting past certain things, that speech piece really was sitting there and no one was really doing much about it. And I was young enough and early enough in my career where I just was entering EI, and I had, parents were always in my private practice sessions. And so there wasn't even much to read about Down syndrome in terms of speech and language and how you can improve it. It was just kind of general. And parents, so I was asking parents, there wasn't much for me there was no classes to take. And so parents just said, I really want to understand him when he talks. I really want other people to know that he is more than they think he is, that he's funny and that he's smart and he has things to say. And this was the common theme, and it was every family I saw. And so luckily, being naive enough, I was like, okay, then that's what we'll do. So I just really focused on how we can make that happen. And I kind of let go some of the language pieces, and even AAC a little bit. We were using everything, but really what I found was no one was doing this. And I was having some success. And so parents were kind of word of mouth. And then, over 10 years, I was like, gosh, I think I have something here. And there's, I'm getting burned out. This is way too much for me to handle. And that kind of led me to the teletherapy side, but then also led me to hiring people and growing my practice so that I could have that time to really kind of focus here on that speech piece for people with Down syndrome. And then just that early love of fluency, I think really I just like speech more than I like the other aspects of our field. And I always liked voice as well. And so as I was doing more and more things with people with Down syndrome, I was like, man, we're missing this little extra piece. Why are they still difficult to understand a lot of the time, especially when they become teenagers? We've got this great 3-year-old who at 8 years old isn't so understandable anymore. And then at 15, then at 16. And so it was just hard to figure out what was going on until I was really like, I don't think this isn't articulation. This isn't phonology. It isn't even really fluency because it's neurogenic fluency. So even some of our, best techniques didn't always work. And it was just kind of like working with a canvas that had never been worked with before. And so it really just kind of led me to be very curious and find out what I could. And that's obviously how I found LSVT too, was just I'm missing something. They're perfectly easy to understand in single words. Sounds are good, but when they go to tell you a story or anything open-ended, things kind of fall apart.
Great. Yeah. Well, it sounds like that communication piece was what they wanted and what you wanted to focus on. So it was a perfect kind of blend of everything there.
Yes.
And you took off with it. So I'd love to hear a success story about, someone you've worked with LSVT LOUD with Down syndrome and how that impacted their daily life.
I kind of always use the first person that I used this with. She was just the perfect candidate. And I've had less than perfect candidates, and it's great also. But I like her story because I think this is what really caused me to start talking to LSVTs. Like I was emailing you guys and I was asking questions on the Facebook page. And that's kind of how, and I was like, you have to hear this. Like, this is really cool. And Dr. Fox, of course, being who she is, was like, she thought it was cool too. And so she really was like the perfect candidate to kind of propel me forward. She's kind of interesting. She was 12, 13 at the time, I think 14. And she'd struggled really. She has good speech, actually. Phenomenal reader, but this goofy fluency that would just kind of come in and really just wreck her ability to communicate. And so I thought, okay, so she's not super severe. Maybe this is kind of a nice, safe, she's older. This might be a good way to kind of introduce myself and make sure things are great. And after watching the course and then kind of doing it almost right away, a few things just kind of popped up like, oh man, week 3. I was to the point where I was like, oh no, this better work. Week 1 and week 2 are great. Week 3. And then I remembered, I was like, oh wait, I heard Dr. Fox's voice in my head, like, just stay the course, just keep going. And sure enough, she was right. Almost like to the day on week 4, things were happening. And some of those things were her school IEP had just happened, and her mom told the SLP at school, like, oh, we're doing this therapy. It seems to be working really well. the therapist just on her own put that into the IEP and then started just giving her some loud cues like, oh, let's use your loud voice there. And so that was exciting because I didn't even have to go and like plead with another therapist. Here's what we're doing. Maybe you can try it. And so that got just kind of stuck into her IEP. And I was like, ooh, this is cool. And then mom would tell me they went to church and someone stopped her kind of on the way out, like, what's changed with her? She like raised her hand today and asked a question. And I was like, oh my gosh, she was very shy, very sweet. Like one of those kids where you're like, ooh, I need to get you mad a little bit because I need to motivate you. She just was pleasant, which can be tough as an SLP sometimes. And so we were starting to get this crazy feedback from other people spontaneously. And then mom started telling stories and I was seeing her regularly anyway. So it's not like I had to go and find her to come back and see if she needed updating or maintenance or anything. I was still seeing her. And just how long that kept helping. And the other weird thing that with her, people with Down syndrome don't usually correct themselves. They kind of use us as a corrector, right? That's kind of how we teach it. And so a lot of them will just go through life until someone stops them and asks them to say it again. They don't really kind of monitor their own speech very well. And so that was kind of going on, and we finished at LSVT and it was great. And we were still doing a lot of the things, but she really kind of was that mousy, she was kind of here, she was kind of low and just kind of had a cute high voice, which is also kind of rare. And by the end of those 4 weeks and even after, she was just physically more confident. Like she was like, oh, I can do this. And I really think it was the piece that I was doing, but not doing well, which is that extreme repetition, that intensity of saying the same thing, functional things over and, hundreds of times.
Yeah.
And, we were all, in some therapists, I think that read about it or hear about it are like, oh man, I don't know if I can do that. That sounds so boring. It's almost, kind of the drill that we were taught to use and then not use when we were in school. But it really gave her that confidence. She just was like, all right, I know what's coming next. I know how long I have to do this. I'm not worried you're going to spring something on me, asking you a bunch of questions, which are super hard for people with Down syndrome, even as they get older. And so that confidence too, I was like, oh man, I got to tell people this. And and then she could start to self-correct and use the techniques as she needed them. And then one of the things that we put in the course is, a few months after we had finished, it may not have been quite that long, but I asked her, what are you doing in social studies? She liked that class. So answering questions is hard. What did you do? Kind of just in the recent past. And she answered, she said, a woman's right to vote.
Wow.
And I was like, what? And her mom would kind of sit outside the door, because she didn't want her mom in there because she's a teenager, So mom would sit just outside the door and she kind of peeked her head over and she's like, that's what they're doing. And I was just like, oh my, you get chills and you're like, what? So she was my first kind of big one. And that's where I really started sharing some of the stuff with LSVT. Like, this is amazing. I don't know if you know that. With this population.
Yeah. Well, she sounds like the perfect first candidate to really springboard off of and give you that confidence too, that I can try this with others.
Right.
And that's so inspiring. And it's so neat to see. So you could see it in her, others are commenting on it, her mom. So that's really neat. It's definitely making an impact, not just you, the therapist. I think, sometimes we get caught up in, is it just me? Because we're working so closely, but it's so validating to hear others also say yes, and especially spontaneously, like, what changed with you? So that's a really, really neat story about her.
That was fun.
Great. Well, and I'm wondering if you've encountered any challenges on your journey when applying LSVT LOUD to those with Down syndrome, and if so, what have you done to overcome those?
I think, initially it's the how am I going to get this funded? Right? I mean, insurance, and depending on where you work. So in the private sector for me, it's mostly Medicaid and some private insurance. So that was the first kind of panic attack. Like, how are we going to get, how are we going to get this funded? And I know from listening to other SLPs, if you're in settings where you don't have really access to kind of create your own 16 one-hour sessions, and you might have a boss, or how do we fit this into schools? I didn't really have a lot of those challenging kind of hiccups. So I just, again, not knowing anything, nothing to look at to tell me how to do this, I was her first. So actually with her, because she has, no, it wasn't her, it was someone else after her that had, I'll come back to that story, but Medicaid. And so I asked Medicaid, which is actually pretty good in Colorado, but it was denied. And the reason for denial was super interesting to me and kind of took me to a different place also, which was I had written just kind of to just get the PAR to get going to start. The refusal came back. I rewrote it again. Another denial came back. And the reason for that denial, I think it was written by a doctor. They must have sent it up the chain. He's like, well, this person has had speech therapy since they were 2 years old. Now they're, 7 years old. Why would I give you more therapy time and not less? It doesn't seem to be working. And so that really was like, it really fired me up. I got really mad at first and then confused. And then I was like, okay, I got to explain this.
Yeah.
Here's why that isn't true. And then that really did propel me towards, this is a lifelong issue for people with Down syndrome. Speech therapy isn't a developmental disorder. They're not going to grow out of it. They're not even going to necessarily, once they get a skill, it's not necessarily just going to keep being great. We might lose skill. There's things that impact their ability to communicate throughout the lifespan that can really kind of set us back. How do we get back from that? And so I spent a lot of time finding all the research I could. And then I just wrote a kind of a response with every reason why that was that just wasn't a true statement. And here's why we need this intensive therapy. And it worked.
Right.
So I just kind of drowned them.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds perfect. So now are you able to just get one after the other once you
I still get the
denial?
Yeah.
Okay.
I still get the denials here and there. But that's what I do. I kind of just scare them into a lot of research that they're like, oh, okay. Yeah. I'm thinking that's what it is. So I have been able since that time to get that service covered. So that was kind of hard at first, but it worked. And it was good knowledge.
Well, it's hard to deny research. And
right.
I guess speaking of research, are there new developments in this world with LSVT LOUD and Down syndrome? And if so, anything that you find particularly exciting or promising?
We have Dr. Carol Bullock. We have with Dr. Fox and Angela. They have that first phase 1 research for Down syndrome that we were using. And that was the study that really said, listen, they can handle it. Right. So a lot of parents were like 1 hour for 4 days a week for 4 weeks. They're not going to tolerate that because we have a lot of odd behaviors with Down syndrome, not odd, but pretty prevalent refusal behaviors that can really be challenging for SLPs. So that was what was coming from the parent side. And even the SLPs were like, I could barely get them to sit down for 5 minutes. How am I going to get them to sit down for an hour? And so that study looked at a subgroup of people and said, actually, they can handle it for 1 hour. Parents had positive things to say after the program was finished, and we made gains. And so I kind of attribute that back to the story I just told, where she loved it. She loved that repetition. It wasn't boring for her because she was successful. So all of a sudden, she gets a full hour of not being corrected, of not being asked questions that she can't answer or struggles to answer. And so I think that was a big piece of why that 1 hour isn't that hard. And we can really, in teletherapy, how I've been doing it too, is it's all visual. And people with Down syndrome learn visually. And so, just putting things on the screen for biofeedback, or we would use their interests, things they like, and I can cater that so quickly onto a PowerPoint and share it like you and I are now, that I didn't have to fumble around. It wasn't a lot of game playing or entertaining. It was really just, okay, here's my stuff, which they like. I can see myself. I can see you. And so I think that kind of helped a bit. And you can't, there's not a lot of distractions compared to doing it maybe in a more open area where visual learners can be easily distracted. I'm not sure. That's my guess. And so I think that's where we kind of are with the research piece. And then hopefully doing more and more to see how, how does it maintain? How is this working? What is it working on? Kind of that neuroplasticity is I'm hoping that goes. And I've used a lot of, I had a background somewhat in apraxia also. So that motor planning research says exactly what LSVT LOUD says, right? So that really intense and frequent therapy for speech practice is what works. And it seems so simple now, but that's what these people with Down syndrome are not getting at any age. We're giving them, maybe 5 minutes of repetitions or 1 hour a week in early intervention, and then maybe 30 minutes in school, and then maybe some AAC things here and there, but just the lack of enough therapy, it shouldn't really shock us that they're not good at speaking. They've had very little practice talking. And as they get older, that gets worse. And so I'm hoping that we can kind of share that more and more and more through research, that this is what we need. The only way to improve speech clarity and language use is to do it a lot. And even if we just look at a 2-year-old who's typical and we look at a 2-year-old who has Down syndrome, how many words is the typical child trying to learn and mess up and play with and develop, and compared to the person with Down syndrome who may be not talking very much, being quizzed, having to go through and learning all these other things at the same time. So I'm hoping that's the piece that really I was missing, I think. But all therapists need to know that really it can work if we go by the research, if we look and see what actually works for neuroplasticity and any new habit. Really, I mean, speech is movement too. And so how long does it take you to develop a new habit through movement? And then all of speech and language is crazy complex, right? You can't even separate it from personality or cognition. And so it's so complex that we almost need something simple to kind of come in and, just allow that complexity to develop without kind of hanging it up. You're like, oh, I got to pay attention to this one sound while I'm talking to you today. It's really hard.
Yeah.
But if I can focus on loud, I don't have to think about that. And now I can think about what I say.
Yeah. Wow. I think everything you've said is so spot on. That intensity matters. You're saying that salient practice is mattering because you get that motivation piece when they're doing it. And then that focus on loudness. So it's great. It's all the perfect package there. So what do you think are the main issues that SLPs are facing when treating individuals with Down syndrome?
I think it's just a lack of information. We all recently read, and I put it in the course too, that most SLPs will treat someone with Down syndrome in their career. They know what it is. They know what it looks like. They know what it sounds like. And people that are working in pediatrics have, I think, a unfortunate view of the capabilities of people with Down syndrome. Those behaviors I was talking about are quite prevalent, and that research is fascinating. They tend to not want to work hard in a chronic sense across the board. And what the research is kind of saying is it's not due to speech and language difficulties. It's all by itself. But what are we being told? What do SLPs, who gets blamed for a lack of progress because of behavior. It's almost always as the speech and language capabilities of the child. Well, he's frustrated because he can't tell us what he wants. He's frustrated because he can't this, he can't this, he can't this. And I don't think that's true. And the research is starting to come out and saying, you know what, this is all by itself. Even my best communicators are doing those same behaviors. And so knowing that for SLPs, I think we can kind of put that behavior aside, because that really is, if you poll, then there's some, not many out there that I've found, but most of them are just, it's so hard to work with a child who's constantly trying to get out of working, especially in a school setting, or right. So we have that kind of refusal, and they might flop on the floor. They might refuse to speak. And they are very sensitive to correction. So even one no, or one, oh, I don't know about that one, you might want, let's do it again. Anything they perceive as correction tends to shut them down quickly. But it is not because of speech and language. It's just part of that Down syndrome phenotype. And so what I've been trying to do is kind of coach therapists and teach therapists through that part of it. Like, these are those behaviors, but here's how we can kind of work with those. And LSVT was great for that, because it really showed almost the near exact opposite of what we were afraid of. Here's someone who can now handle this long, intensive work because we skipped it, and we made him successful right off the bat. So I can get it, and it's really fun to watch sometimes. I've had parents cry. I've had people like, oh my God, what just happened? Just kind of teaching those strengths. Here's what they're good at. Here's what they're not good at.
Yeah.
And if we give them that repetition that not only they need, but they like, and it's super simple. It's not, it's kind of like a golf swing. If you've ever tried to learn golf, you hit the ball with a stick. It sounds easy. It's not. There's like 200 things you have to think of at the exact same time, which is what language and speech are. So if I can just give them one thing that makes them immediately clear, which LOUD does, slows you down, you over-articulate, you have time to think about how many words you might want to say or not say, and it hits fluency, because you can't have hard glottal attacks when you're being loud with continuous voicing. And so it just hit all the boxes, and it was simple, because executive functioning is really hard for these kids. They can't do a lot at once well. And so this really was that. And I was using melodic intonation, which I still use, but LOUD is even simpler than that. And so I forgot the original question that you asked me with that one. Kind of got off my own.
That was perfect. No, that's great. Yeah. Well, and to wrap up, I was kind of just going to ask, and it flows into this a little bit, about what you might say to families who might be considering LSVT LOUD as a treatment approach for their child with Down syndrome.
Right. And that can be the other kind of taxing piece, is trying to figure out when can you do those 16 sessions, because they do need to be intensive, within the 1 month. I haven't had issues with that in private practice as much, because I use teletherapy. So that is a tool that we accidentally realized was also wonderful for LSVT LOUD, because in Parkinson's, we're typically talking about adults who are older, who might be retired, who can get to a clinic 1 hour a day. Our kids, they have parents that drive them, and they usually aren't the only child. They're in school. They have soccer after school. They have all these other things. Parents are working. It's very difficult to get that extra therapy time. And so that was the most challenging. Teletherapy stopped a lot of that. And so we were able to have that hour after school, kind of easier, or before school. My first one, we did it right before school every morning. And that was easy, because mom didn't have to travel. And so in the Denver area, it's any city, right? We don't all live in the same neighborhood either. So how much time can we convince a parent to drive to a location for therapy? But that really kind of helped it. So that here we have something where you don't have to leave, and it's a lot less cancellations.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not, the snow or the rain, or, his sister is sick, but he's fine. I can't get there, the car broke down. All of those things kind of disappear with the addition of that visual piece that we could use through teletherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I share that with parents and we try to schedule it that way. I know a lot of SLPs are in the schools, and it's not that simple. But I think once you can show them that it works, even, we can do some pre-trial stuff. So we can say, hey, let's try it. Let's see what this looks like. And most of the time when a parent sees it, and having the parent with you really is important too. I know some clinics are always like, nope, parents in the waiting room, not my thing. I really want them there, even if they have to be around the corner. So that they know how to use it at home, right?
Yeah.
Because we have that homework that's also part of that 16 week block, but then maintenance also.
Mm-hmm.
And so once we can kind of show them, look, this is really simple and look what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so sharing some of those stories too is how we've kind of tried to overcome those, or scheduling things on summer break or Christmas break.
Yeah.
Some kids, are at home for homeschooling. There's so many options. And I think that, even if you're stuck on that, you can always do what I do and email LSVT Global or go on FaceTime or Facebook for some of the live
Mm-hmm.
question and answers. And we have all that stuff now. We've started compiling to kind of hit those big question marks where people are doubtful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, this is hugely helpful. I feel like you've touched everything. How you work with the children and teenagers with Down syndrome, how you're working with family members. You're also helping other SLPs and what they may be able to achieve in their own practices. So I really appreciate your time here today and for sharing your wisdom and guidance. So thank you so much for being our guest today.
I could talk
And
about this all the time.
we will have to have you back because I feel like there's a whole nother list of questions I would like to ask you. So thank you for being with us today. And before we close, I just want to make sure I'm giving credit where it's due for our podcast here too. So the theme song that you're hearing with the podcast, this is called Think Loud for Parkinson's by Kindred Spirit and Leo Sayer. And this is a new song and video that was inspired actually by LSVT LOUD speech treatment, and it was developed to raise awareness for Parkinson's worldwide. And it's available for purchase on iTunes and Amazon, and the proceeds are being split between a UK charity, Cure Parkinson's, and the Parkinson's Foundation in the US. I also want to give credit to our production team who makes all the behind the scenes work so that the show is possible, and that's CS Design Studios. And for anyone that's interested in learning more about LSVT Loud speech therapy or LSVT big physical or occupational therapy, or if you're interested in finding a therapist in your area, you can go to our website. It's lsvtglobal.com. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a newly launched podcast, so we would love to have you join us on our journey. And so we encourage you to subscribe. You should be able to click on the button below wherever you get your podcasts. And until the next one, we look forward to thinking big and loud with you again. So thank you.